All right, so I think given the topic, probably a good place to start is what we actually are talking about when we're talking about circular cities. Sean, I know earlier this year that New Lab launched a circular city program in New York. So I was hoping you could start by telling us a little bit about what that program is, what a circular city is, and what you hope to achieve.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yes, New Lab is a community about 155 different technology startups based in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, just opposite the island of Manhattan. And with the innovation studio around Circular City, our goal was to develop collaboration across a bunch of different partnerships and stakeholders to find a way to collect and analyze data from New York City, different areas of New York City, including Brooklyn, and utilize that to actually improve the lives of the residents where that data was collected. So taking urban planning insights and helping to then improve urban planning decisions of the future through that. So that was the circular nature of it, which was that we were not only collecting data to develop a product or generate revenue, but to actually improve the livelihoods and the urban experience of the people involved in data collection. And so what you see across these panelists is really what the original vision was, which was to bring together leaders in academia and research, combine them with some of the early stage entrepreneurs and technology being developed both in the New Lab community, but around the world, and partner them with government bodies, both local and state level, to find out what insights we could develop and how we could alter decisions moving forward for the better.
And Sean, as you mentioned, a lot of what it means to create a smart city is driven by data. And some of this data is going to be collected through public-private partnerships. Some of it's only going to be collected on the public side. Some of it's going to be collected on the private side. But we can't neglect the vast amounts of data that governments have already collected and how we can actually turn that into action. And so, Stefan, I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about how you're doing that at the GovLab and how this data is being leveraged to improve our cities and if there are any challenges that are involved with working with government data.
Great. Thanks for having me. And yes, I think one of the key challenges, but also opportunities of the current data age involves actually how do we set up processes to reuse data that is already collected. And of course, one of those data sets quite often resides within the public sector. And so for the last few years, we have looked into how do we unlock data sets that the government is collecting in order to use it for other purposes than initially intended in a responsible manner. And so what we have seen that open government data can be used for a variety of purposes. One, of course, to improve government itself, and especially as it relates to some of the challenges that cities have. Two, to enable individuals make better decisions so that they actually know, for instance, what hospital to go to for what condition and which when to take a bus, for instance, which happens to be based upon open government data. Three, to actually increase economic opportunity. We did, for instance, a study on how businesses are using open data, and we saw that open data has a huge business value as well for a variety of reasons, including optimizing its own processes. And then fourthly, it can be used to solve public problems, including, for instance, environmental sustainability. Is it easy? Obviously not. And I think the transaction cost of accessing open data is substantially decreased if there is a policy in place. And so we advocate that every city should adopt a policy that starts with open by default and then also has the processes that can identify priority data sets that have a purpose, such as, for instance, a purpose for the circular economy.
And Stefan, you mentioned transportation, specifically buses, and how that data is used to tell people where the bus is at, for instance. And I think using data to overhaul our city's transportation sectors is actually one of the more exciting and I think promising aspects of creating a circular city and a smart city in the future. And I cycle almost everywhere I go in New York, but in the last few months, there was a spate of cyclist deaths. We hit all-time highs, and it kind of started making me think twice about, getting on my cycle and going anywhere. And, Tara, I know that you've done a lot of work in this space. Can you tell me a little bit about what the work you're doing at Numina and how data can actually make pedestrian transportation safer within cities?
Yeah, so I guess to back up a little bit, my background is in public health research, studying how city design affects people's behaviors that then affect their health. And we now know that active transportation is a really great intervention to prevent obesity and therefore all of the other chronic disease that is so closely linked with obesity. So by active transportation, I mean pretty much anything that's not just getting in your car. It's walking, biking, doing something intermodal with public transportation. And that's why we see a lot of people in cities, looking fit and getting out there. But a lot of our cities, especially in the US, are planned pretty narrowly around car counts. That's the data set that they have. And so if you're a planner, it's quite easy to justify infrastructure for cars because you have lots of data to support those decisions. And historically, unfortunately, cities haven't had a lot of data around everyone else that uses streets, namely bicyclists and pedestrians. And so our sensor is designed to count them, not just lane counts. It's you can't count a person by putting a puck under the pavement or a tube across the road. So we make a camera-based technology that does this in a totally privacy-first way. But we're able to show the paths of all kinds of different travelers and streets, differentiate what mode they're traveling by. So if it's on foot or on a bicycle, scooter, or something else. And what this allows us to do is at street level, really determine, where there are bottlenecks, where people cross outside of a crosswalk, for example, and actually work toward designs that create a more delightful and usable street and safer street for non-car users as well as for car users. And I think there's kind of this understanding that if you make the street accessible and safe for your most vulnerable users, you're actually making it better for everyone, including drivers. So we by showing the paths and dwell times and anonymous aggregate behaviors of all different users and streets, empower cities to kind of have that information to make data-driven decisions, not just around car infrastructure, but actually getting kind of the road share to match the mode share. So New York City we actually work in more than 20 cities around the world, cities big and small. We are based in New York and work with New Lab. New York is a city that, has much higher pedestrian numbers than other places. And so you see places where, for example, 80% of the road space is for cars, but actually only 20% of the throughput is cars. How do we actually flip that so that 80% of space actually matches the 80% of traffic that's actually pedestrians and bicycles, for example? So that's generally how we're working at the city level. And then actually as part of this program with Circular Cities and New Lab, we also were bringing other research and private sector partners to the table with that data to work with neighborhood planners to actually achieve a more holistic vision of the neighborhood.
And so, of course, it's not just pedestrian travel that I think stands to benefit from this. One of New Yorkers' favorite pastimes, I think, is actually complaining about public transit. So there's a lot of room to grow there. Greg, it sounds like you know a little bit about that. I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about how technology and data are being incorporated into MTA specifically, but how these can drive better public transit sectors going forward.
Sure. Yeah. The city and the state are wanting to invest a lot of money in renovating a very old and antiquated subway system and bus system. If we had the kind of data that Tara was talking about, we could not only talk about when you get on the subway, but also what bus you connect to or what the last mile is to get to your home. There's so much more that we could do if we had sort of end-to-end pathways, but there are privacy challenges around collecting that, as she alluded to. And the actual technology itself in the subway is so antiquated. The signaling technology, some of it dates back 50 years. We need to update that just to increase the capacity. If we could use modern signaling techniques, we could do that. We need to do track monitoring. That was something that we helped with Columbia to renovate the L train, which, believe it or not, actually finished today. being renovated in spite of all the threats around having to close that tunnel and so forth. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and not just for the MTA, as you suggested. There's a lot of modeling we could do if we had all the data that wasn't locked up, as Stefan was saying. For example, we don't even know whether congestion control in Lower Manhattan is going to be effective from a traffic standpoint, much less a health monitoring standpoint or other things like this. And so there's a lot of opportunities for collecting that data, doing deeper, more interesting analytics and modeling to inform policymakers about best practices.
And I think you brought up a good point, Greg, which is, this isn't just limited to what is happening in New York City. We've been talking a lot about New York today, but I was hoping, Sean, you could maybe tell me a little bit about, based on the fact that New Lab is, focusing on New York right now, how does the city act as a sandbox, so to speak, for implementing these ideas in other cities? Like, is this just about creating models? And, how applicable is what the work you're doing in New York to, cities around the US or even around the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you have two different pieces there. One is the scalability of the program itself, or the ability to localize it to other areas. And I think that's the beauty of this innovation studio, and why it's seen the amount of kind of coverage and fanfare that it has, is because it can easily be transported to new geographies. There are key pieces you need, obviously. You need supportive researchers and academic institutions like the folks you're seeing here today. You need to have access to that type of research body to help analyze and develop the insights that the pilot provides. Then you need a great group of entrepreneurs and startup technologists like Numina and Carmera and CitySense. Over the 3 years this studio has been operating, we've had north of 300 startups apply globally to be part of it. So the talent isn't just specific to New York. We were lucky that we had talent like this in our building to utilize for this program. But there's interest to participate in developing prototypes and deploying them from technologists around the world. You need supportive government. It's important to reference, this is one of our studios that is the most mature. It's in its 3rd year of operation, and its funding has come through the New York City EDC, the Economic Development Corporation. So we've had to rely on certainly government partnerships to make this successful. But none of these are factors that you can't find in other cities around the world to replicate and expand this program. And we're actually quite hopeful and ambitious that that will be the next step for us.
And, I'm glad you brought that up because, as you mentioned, actually getting this data is a huge part of the problem. And so, Stefan, I was hoping you could speak to the public side of that. How can we ensure that governments are not only, making this data available, but that it's being collected in a responsible manner? And also, if you're opening this up, you're opening it up to everyone. So how can we ensure it's used in a responsible manner as well?
Yeah, that's a big question, but obviously, I think there are a few ways to think about it. One is that in order to make it responsibly used, we also have to know what are the uses that we would like to see it used for. And I think it's very important to not just assume that you will release data that then is going to be used, A, and B, it's going to be used responsibly. So there is also a role for governments and organizations like New Lab, through, for instance, this excellent Circular City initiative, to start prioritizing certain kinds of purposes that data could be used for. Absent that kind of priority list of what is the purpose, what are the questions, it is too much happenstance, and quite often it also leads to actually insights that are not that useful and don't really matter. So that's the first one. The second one is that obviously we need to adopt a end-to-end kind of data responsibility approach, by which I mean is that risks are not just at the sharing or the reusing stage. There are risks across the data lifecycle, at the collection stage, how it is being stored, how it is being prepared, how it is then being shared, how it is being analyzed, and how it is being used. There are risks involved across the lifecycle. And so we need to have a end-to-end kind of lifecycle approach in order to really understand what are the risks and what are the best ways for mitigating those risks that are context-specific and appropriate. And then the third element I would say is that we actually need a new profession which we call data stewards, that are not just individuals that care about locking up data in a secure manner, but are individuals that care about opening up data in a responsible manner, which also means responsible for certain kinds of public interest purposes. And that's a whole different mindset than typically what you see happening in, for instance, security context, but it also is a particular kind of skill set that understands what it can be used for, as opposed to just opening up data and then assuming that they will come. And as we all know, if you build it, will they come? Turns out that in most cases, that is kind of limited. And so having a more proactive stewardship role is really what we need to have here.
And Tara, I was hoping you could speak to the private side of this. You know, with all this data that's going to be generated in these smart cities, a lot of that is going to be by intelligent systems. You know, Numina is using machine vision, as you had mentioned earlier. So how can companies that are, you know, looking to enter into these sorts of relationships with local governments ensure that these intelligent systems are being used responsibly?
Well, I love everything that Stefan just said, because we care a lot about privacy. And one of the challenges being on the private sector side is you can make the decisions you want to make about how you design your product, but I actually think it behooves governments to build some of that expertise internally so that they can appropriately vet their vendors. And maybe it's not even within the government. Maybe this data steward, for example, is a third-party organization that really has, you know, certain governance in place, or board members and processes that ensure that that data life cycle is being accounted for across interests and across the landscape. I can say that for us, the way that we ensure responsible use of data is really, our product is completely privacy by design. So even though, yes, we're using a camera-based sensor in our case, the way that our product works, we are using imagery to glean insights about places, but we process that imagery on board our hardware, our sensor on site at the edge, and then we don't save or transmit any of the imagery. We don't ever collect any personally identifiable information intentionally. We're doing everything we can to really minimize the data collected at the edge. So first and foremost, I think a lot of data collection for cities has to do with, well, the best practice of that should be around right-sizing your data collection. Collecting only what you need, not more, not less, and then making sure that you have, you know, secure practices to maintain and share that data. And then the last thing I'll just say quickly, to Stefan's point, I actually think that your data policies should be super legible. Like our privacy policy is designed so anyone, you know, any layperson can understand it within 5 minutes. And those data policies should also include intended data uses so that you're not over collecting, and so that you can actually say, here are things we don't want the data to be used for. It's just sort of, you know, ethical when we're talking about especially public realm and spaces where as citizens we don't get to just opt in like with a private platform.
And, you know, I'm glad you brought that up, because ultimately a city is nothing without the people who inhabit it. And so, you know, we've been talking a lot about how governments and private sector are, you know, collaborating and also working independently to create these cities of the future. But to conclude, Greg, I was hoping you could tell me if you had any thoughts on how the citizenry themselves can actually contribute to making the cities that we want to see going forward, and what that contribution might look like.
Yeah, I think we already see this in some ways. Citizen data scientists who crawl through the open sets that the city provides help police and sort of keep track of these issues that Tara and Stefan were raising. But they also spot opportunities. I think another big challenge to add to Stefan's list would be integrating data across different silos. That whenever I talk to people, there's lots of data. It's just locked up in weird formats, needs a lot of cleaning, a lot of work to understand, to visualize it. And I think some of the best innovation comes from just the individual citizen who digs into the data and wants to answer a question and really does that. So the more we can provide tools to them and open up data sets to the general public and be forthcoming about what we're doing with the data, I think the more they'll participate. But we also have to educate people about these risks and these challenges that everybody's talking about, and the opportunities that, you know, what can we do with the data.
Well, I could spend all day talking about this issue. There's so much more to cover. Thank you all so much for coming on this panel and telling us about the work you do and how we're going to create the city of the future.
Thank you.